BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
This podcast contains adult themes, very strong language, and language that may offend. It's a hot, sweaty evening on June 16th, 1966, and Stokely Carmichael is addressing an audience in Greenwood, Mississippi. He's the newly appointed chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and has just been released from jail. The reason for his imprisonment? 10 days before, a black man named James Meredith began a 220-mile protest march against fear from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. He was doing this walk to highlight deep-seated racism and to stand up to vigilante white supremacists in the South who wouldn't let a black man travel unmolested, and to encourage black people to vote, because a new act had just been passed to ensure their right to do so. But on the second day, a sniper, a white salesman, shot him in the head, neck, and back, and the police did nothing to protect him. Although Meredith survived, he could no longer continue, and civil rights leaders like Reverend Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael finished the march on his behalf. Hassled all the way along the route, Carmichael's just been released from police custody, and he's about to make a speech that's going to launch a movement.
Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. We want black power. 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 That's right. That's what we want. Black power. And we don't have to be ashamed of it. Now from now on, when they ask you what you want, you know what to tell them. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? Everybody, what do you want? That's what we gonna get.
Those words by Stokely Carmichael would resonate around the world, inspiring some, but instilling fear in others. They would reach the ears of Michael X, and a year from now, Stokely and Michael will share a stage in London. The repercussions of them coming together will lead to Stokely being kicked out of the UK and Michael imprisoned. In the previous episode of Who Was Michael X, we heard how Michael embraced the counterculture movement and forged friendships with some of its leading figures. William Burroughs, Barry Miles, who ran Zapple, the Beatles' experimental label, and Peter Jenner, the manager of Pink Floyd. We also heard how he built a relationship with the Nation of Islam and the heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali. In this episode, we're going to see Michael becoming the leading black voice in the UK and explore whether his organisation, RAS, the Racial Adjustment Action Society, was effective in changing the lives of black people in Britain. My name is Hamza Salmi, and this is Who Was Michael X, Episode 5, Black Power.
Justice is a very, very strange type of word. In this country, there's justice. There's justice for white men, and there's justice for black men. The kind of justice that is for white men does not apply to the black man.
Michael X gave this speech as the president of the Racial Adjustment Action Society in Bradford in August 1967. At the time, RAS was part of the first wave of black activist groups in the UK, inspiring people to action. The late Ben Busquet, a former Notting Hill resident and anti-apartheid activist, had this to say about Michael.
I think the reason why people liked Michael and followed him is because he was beginning to explain things in a way that kids could understand. He began to explain things in terms of their blackness and their role. They had to be conscious of their role in society because of their blackness. Now, nobody was explaining that at that time. What we had at that time was people telling us what we should do within the society. Nobody told you after you've been beaten by a group of thugs, why it was that you had been beaten. They just told you, don't worry about it. Well, you had to worry about it because you're the one who got the licks.
Michael was the central figure of RAS. He was canny about grabbing press interest, so that stories which might have been overlooked were actually reported. Like the time he got a TV crew to go to Preston to cover a textile union dispute in 1965, where the mainly black and Asian workforce went on strike and the union bosses, who were white, did not. Michael was excellent at self-promotion, but the media also craved a figure like him.
There was nobody else.
Derek Humphreys is a writer and former journalist who co-wrote a book on Michael in the 1970s.
Whereas in America you had different leaders, Elijah Muhammad of the Black Muslims, you had Malcolm X, you had Martin Luther King, and other pretty intelligent, fiery spokespeople. In Britain, all we had was Michael X. And that's how he was the only instant black voice the media could turn to get an opinion, to get something to put in a headline.
And being that spokesperson was hard work, pioneering work, which Michael relished, as he pointed out in an interview with Nicholas Harman on the BBC programme Personal Choice.
Take a look at the animal kingdom. If you take wild horses and go to any cowboy picture, you'll find one wild horse will run to the top of the hill, wherever it be, and look over and see greener pastures, and then all of the rest will come forward and eat of that lush green pasture. Fortunately or unfortunately in this country, I am the man who has a great capacity for work. And
but are you the man who has the capacity for work, or are you the man who has the capacity for words?
Words are work. You are a man of words yourself. In order to be a man of words like yourself, one had to spend a considerable amount of time learning, studying, practicing, day after day. I have spent many, many years at working, and the results of my work is obvious that it has to be shown. If I was a layabout who used to stand up by some street corner doing nothing but just proselytizing about what should happen and what shouldn't happen, then I would not be heard. I am heard by the simple reason by being a hard worker.
I think the trouble is, because the London scene was really quite small at that point, he started to believe his own publicity.
Barry Miles, as you might remember from the last episode, was a friend of Michael's.
And of course, he was perfect for the tabloids. He was often in them, and you know, he would say stuff and it would be reported in the national press. And so he thought that he was pretty important.
Michael also knew that an organisation needed an image. These guys presented well.
They had uniforms. The uniform was made by a girlfriend of Michael. She had a clothes shop on Parkway. These beautiful satin tops with a rolled collar. You know, they looked like pop stars rather than some kind of militant action group.
It's strange that despite being in the press and becoming the go-to voice for black opinion, that today Michael X is a figure that few have heard of. Here is his daughter, Hasina Malik.
The amount of stuff that he was doing, and it was all in the press and it was all out there and everyone knew, to there not being anything. There not being anything. What scared them so much about this man, and who does it serve? What has happened to the history of those things?
Undoubtedly, Michael's reputation became tarnished in later life. Maybe that's why he's been forgotten. But many people, including the black activist and broadcaster Darcus Howe, felt Michael exaggerated his power. Michael would claim that RAS had 60,000 members. But even his close friends like Barry Miles believed he built up the organization's reputation far beyond its achievements or capabilities.
He liked to portray himself as the UK's Malcolm X, but I mean, I don't know how many followers Michael really had. I think an awful lot of the guys that were in RAS were kind of drifting. They had problems in British society. They didn't know quite what their role was supposed to be. So he gave them a role, and they did look up to him. I mean, a lot of them really did go along with the whole thing. For instance, there used to be a club called the UFO Club, run by Hoppy and Joe Boyd.
Hoppy, you may remember from the last episode, was a photographer and key figure in the counterculture movement in the UK. He took pictures of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Muhammad Ali, among others, and lived with Barry Miles.
But Hoppy was in jail. And so I was collecting the money for a few weeks, and At one point, some North London gangsters had obviously done a dry run the week before to see what I did with the money, and then they came and robbed me. They were waiting in my doorway when I got back from the club at 3 a.m, and one of them used a pickaxe handle to knock my briefcase out of my hand, and the other one sprayed me with ammonia. They only got away with a very small amount of money. But they had my address book in there, so they called up and said, take your business out of North London, Mr. Miles, or we'll sort of slit your throat. So I was really freaked, and Michael immediately stepped in, sort of snapped his fingers, and there was a couple of guys in the doorway across the street for about a week. And in the end, I realised that I'm too much in debt to Michael. I do not want this to carry on any longer, because you've got to pay back that kind of favour, So I went off to Amsterdam for a couple of weeks, and then it all disappeared. But the fact he was able to do that impressed me. They were there in their wonderful satin tops, and so all night, you could get up in the middle of the night, have a piss, and look out the window, you'd be watching, man, looking incredible. So he did have some kind of organisation. It wasn't entirely fantasy, but.
The words fantasy and bullshit were also frequently used in the interview I had with Pete Jenner, the former manager of Pink Floyd. But I asked, was he sincere?
Sorry, what were you saying?
I was saying, do you think Michael was sincere?
Oh, yeah. I think it was all, we all had very good ideas and fantasies, but we weren't very good at delivering.
Michael didn't deliver on his fantasies. Accessing circles most could only dream of, hanging out with the likes of Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, and even meeting Martin Luther King, he often frittered away opportunities. For example, he was granted an audience with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And when he met the king, all he could do was play a game of one-upmanship. Speaking through a translator, he asked him,
"How much time did our Prime Minister get with the king?" 10 minutes, he replied. Then, "I want 12, I said. I swear, I saw a twinkle in the king's eye.
By this time, Michael had converted to Islam. He took on the name Michael Abdul Malik. Michael claimed that it was given to him by the striking workers in Preston, many of whom were Muslim. His girlfriend Nancy Bacall, however, recalled it differently. She claimed that it was Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam that gave him his Muslim name in a telephone call. But despite being a headline grabber, one hard reality would not go away for Michael. Money. Michael needed funds to keep Ras alive, and also to pay for 2 households, one with his girlfriend Nancy Bacall, and the other with his wife Desiree and his daughters. With hustling on the back burner, things were tight, and that's where a woman called Carmen came in. Carmen, a wealthy white widow of 30, gave generously to Ras, but it came at a price. The price being Michael himself. An affair began, and as it went on, the checks increased in size, to the detriment of Michael's self-esteem.
With every check received, my peace of mind disintegrated a little more as I moved about the country, finding life more unbearable. So my speeches became more and more bitter. They reached a new peak of anti-white. I was terribly hard on the pouncing and the selling of bodies. I had a lot to say about the awful traps black men fell into, which were terribly degrading for them. I was quite nasty about the women involved. It was myself I was flaying.
It strikes me as ironic that the pimp had turned prostitute himself and was suffering for it. He couldn't take it for long and eventually ended the affair. In another successful bid at self-promotion and money-making, Michael was commissioned to write his autobiography by the publisher Andre Deutsch. This was much to the dismay of the chief editor Diana Athill. Diana will feature later on in Michael's story. She was against the idea, dismissing him as either a nut or a con man. But because the publisher was looking for alternative voices, they went ahead. Michael hoped this book would allow him to go straight and make him some money. At one stage, the News of the World were interested in the serialization. But by the time the completed autobiography came out in 1968, Michael was in prison. And why? Well, it all starts with Stokely Carmichael's visit to London in 1967.
This is going to be a hot world, not a hot summer. It's a hot world. America better wake up to this. If they don't, we're going to burn down America, or they're going to kill 22 million Negroes.
From city after city in this tragic summer of 1967 has come news of violence across America. Rioting, looting, burning, sniping, killing, with the most terrible outbreaks in Newark and Detroit. Hour after hour, television has brought the flames of the ghettos into millions of homes. The orgy of violence and destruction in Detroit has shattered any illusion that measures taken hitherto could damp the flames of Negro revolution. In Detroit alone, the toll of this last week stands at 41 dead, 2,000 injured, and damage to property estimated in hundreds of millions of dollars.
Carmichael had come straight from the Detroit riots, some of the most destructive and violent in US history, which took place between African-American neighborhoods and the city of Detroit's police department. Things got so bad that the National Guard and the Army were called in to quell the violence. At this point, a year on from Carmichael first using the term Black Power, which we heard at the beginning of the episode, a major movement has sprung forth in America. The Black Power movement is trying to achieve self-determination for black people and to counter the commonly held prejudices exhibited by the man interviewing Stokely Carmichael in this clip.
The law has not been written by us. The law has been written by white people for the protection and the benefit of white people and against black people. And that if that law is going to be equal, then we have to say something about that law. We've been denied through force and through legality and through every other means that white people in this country could think of.
But if the people in the ghettos were just given money, wouldn't they in fact continue to create a ghetto society?
How would they?
They wouldn't really know how to develop themselves from a ghetto society.
Oh, no, on the contrary, that's white society speaking to me, telling me that we don't know how to develop ourselves. That's what you told us in Africa, you know, that we didn't know how to develop ourselves, and we had the land and you had the Bible. And when you left, we had the Bible and you had the land.
Whereas the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King had been based upon the Christian ethos of turn the other cheek, Black Power drew its inspiration from Malcolm X's mantra, by any means necessary.
Black people are not going to let white people just slap them anymore.
So what do you see happening now?
Well, every time they slap us, we're going to move to break their arms.
I think that people in Britain are sort of surprised and horrified by these events in the States. Could you see a situation like this arriving in Britain?
Well, I don't know, but I don't see why Britain should be surprised. I mean, Britain used to rule the world for centuries, and she ruled the non-white world, certainly.
There's a lot of confusion about the phrase Black Power. What does it really mean?
The coming together of black people to fight for their liberation by any means necessary.
Carmichael is being interviewed here just outside the Roundhouse in London, where he's been invited to speak at something called the Dialectics of Liberation Conference. He wants to connect with black British people who are interested in the movement and work with them to set up Black Power organisations in the UK. The Dialectics of Liberation Towards a Demystification of Violence, to give it its full name, was a 2-week-long conference in July 1967, and the idea of psychiatrist R.D. Laing, who invited inspirational speakers to talk about and find solutions to the world's problems. Barry Miles went along.
During the dialectics, I mean, it was pretty funky. There was no proper seating or anything. There were people, sitting on the floor mostly and just huddled in corners and stuff, and great clouds of pot smoke around. There was very much that kind of atmosphere there, of tremendous excitement, of ideas being tossed around. Alan was there.
That's Allen Ginsberg. Other beat poets and writers were also there, like William Burroughs, historian C.L.R. James, and the political activist Angela Davis. Music was provided by a band called the Social Deviants, and Emmett Grogan of the San Francisco Diggers, a community action group, was one of the several anarchistic organizations that were present.
One of the American Diggers, he gave a rabble-rousing speech and everybody applauded, and he said, actually, that was by Hitler in 1938. The most interesting thing to me was Gregory Bateson gave a big speech about global warming. I remember it being reported in one of the papers the next day saying he's a complete crank, obviously the world's cooling down, not warming up. And he turned out to be right, though.
Stokely appeared on stage several times during the conference. One notable moment was with the aforementioned beat poet Allen Ginsberg and Emmett Grogan of the San Francisco Diggers, when Carmichael lambasted the hippie movement. Allen Ginsberg was claiming that flower power was making progress. Stokely Carmichael stepped in. "I beg to differ," he said. "I think the reason most of the hippies do that is because they're confused little kids who've run away from home and will return to their culture within a year or two."
There was this party after the Dialectics of Liberation conference, and all the great and the good were there. At one point, Michael came up to me and just opened his jacket and pulled out the top of a cheque from his inside pocket and said, "Another white liberal bites the dust." And whether that money ever went to, helping sort of black orphans or whatever it was, more likely just went straight into Michael's bank account, I'm afraid. The fact that he could even do that to a white person and find it funny, which it was, and we both laughed about it, of course. That was a good example of really the different scenes he was moving around in.
Their civilization, as they call it, stemmed from the fact that they oppressed other peoples, and that the oppression of other people allowed them a certain luxury at the expense of those other people. That has been interpreted as civilization for the West, and that's precisely what is done.
Carmichael gave one of the most electrifying and controversial speeches of the entire conference. In it, he said that white supremacy and capitalism were linked, and he wanted to smash both. He rejected the definitions the West gave the Third World, saying, "I'm always appalled when some white person tells me that progress is being made.
You cannot tell us when progress is being made."
I always ask, progress for whom? In whose terms? He also questioned the concept of England giving independence to the West Indies, saying that's totally absurd. You cannot give independence to anyone. You cannot grant anyone their independence. If it's independence, they just take it.
The Black Power movement has been the catalyst for the bringing together of these young bloods. The real revolutionary proletariat ready to fight by any means necessary for the liberation of our people.
This speech ignited the Black Power movement in the UK. In later years, a number of new organisations sprang up, such as the British Black Panther movement and the Black Liberation Front. Future British Black Power leaders and activists, such as Darcus Howe and Zainab Abbas, who attended, were inspired. Michael befriended Carmichael during his stay, bonding over their Trinidadian roots. Carmichael had heard of him as an unsavoury character, but recognised his political wit, street smart and charm. Michael took him on a tour of the black areas of London, just as he had with Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, and even invited him to his house. Michael appeared on the stage at the conference with Carmichael too, alongside black activist Roy Saw. There is an iconic photo of them all. Michael wearing a black suit, stroking his beard thoughtfully on the left, Roy Saw with his hands clasped on the right, and in the middle, Stokely Carmichael, in shades, waistcoat and tie, remonstrating with the crowd. Behind them are photos of Malcolm X and the words Black Power daubed in black paint. As soon as Carmichael had made his speech, the state sprang into action. They threatened to use the recently passed Race Relations Act to deport him for his inflammatory speech. Special Branch, under the direction of the Home Secretary Roy Jenkins, ordered him to leave the country. Michael X had organised for Carmichael to give a speech at the Rainbow Hall in Reading. Now he was unavailable. Michael stepped in. Newly emboldened, having recently shared the stage with Carmichael and angered by the reaction of the British government, he started speaking to the assembled audience. The press and the secret police were also in attendance.
The most savage human being in the world is the white man. He robbed you of your heritage, your culture. He took everything from you and imposed everything upon you. This is what the white man did to you. This violence, this rape.
But his speech was rambling, more militant than usual, and insulted the British press. Michael referred to them as white monkeys.
Once we got there, we found Michael X putting on a most lurid performance.
Brian Park from the Daily Mail was one of those white monkeys.
Comments he was making was the effect that black brothers should kill white cats, and white cats were nasty, vicious people.
One particular passage caught Michael out when he spoke about his experiences at the Notting Hill riots.
In 1958, I saw white savages kicking black women in the streets and black brothers running away. If you ever see a white laying hands on a black woman, kill him immediately. If you love your brothers and sisters, you would be willing to die for them.
Even though the audience were not particularly fired up by Michael's words, the press wrote verbatim what had been said and printed it in the newspapers the next day. Michael was also interviewed on the news at 10 and defended himself by saying he simply spoke the truth and wanted to be free. 4 days later, Roy Jenkins, the Home Secretary, addressed the House of Commons and announced that in addition to being deported, Stokely Carmichael would never be allowed in the UK again. The Attorney General next rose and announced he had asked the Director of Public Prosecutions for a report on Michael's speech at Reading to decide if he should be prosecuted for inciting people to racial hatred. The law he would be prosecuted under, the Race Relations Act, had ironically been successfully campaigned and lobbied for by black activists to protect them from racial discrimination and persecution. The state decided to prosecute Michael. The trial, held at Court Reading in 1967, was a very public affair and reported avidly by the press. Here he is speaking outside the courtroom.
I most certainly tell my people, don't lie down on the streets anymore and be kicked about in the way how it is they have been kicked about in the past. And I have no intentions personally of sitting down and being kicked all over the place and saying that if we react to this in any way, it's violence. I have no intention of doing that whatsoever.
By this time, Michael was aware of the power of the press and their complicity in maintaining the status quo.
I want to get rid of that man who is oppressing all of you inside of here, whether it is a little white boy or a little black boy. That's the fellow I want to get rid of. But what you read about in the newspapers, and no doubt you'll read about it in the newspapers tomorrow, that I was making an very vicious, anti-white speech, that I am against white people. That's what you read every day. I know, I read it myself. Because that man who controls that newspaper know damn well that if you do something about the system that oppresses you, that he will lose. So he navigates it, seeing that he owns the paper, to put the white working class man and the black working class man to fight each other. Because if he can get us fighting each other, then he can constantly and forever rule all of us.
Michael represented himself in front of the jury, swearing an oath on the Quran before launching his defense. Acknowledging his speech was offensive, he explained that the language he'd heard every day from white people was often offensive to him, and as a result, he'd used that term savages to describe white people because he thought of them in that way. Desiree D'Souza, Michael's wife, appeared on Woman's Hour to defend Michael's position.
He did call white people savages, right?
It's quite possible. I can't remember.
He didn't deny it himself.
Possibly not. We've always been called savages ourselves. I mean, in a hospital, people asked me where was my tail. My patients used to ask me, where was my tail? And I told them, well, it's in cold storage at Plymouth because it's against the law to have one over here. A few times I felt like shoving my fist down a few patients' throats, but then, of course, I was a well-brought-up, genteel young woman, so I didn't do that.
But you don't call saying white people are savages, you don't call this inciting racial hatred. You don't look upon this as wrong. If I were to say all black people are savages, would you be offended at that?
We have been called savages.
Are you offended at it?
I'm offended, but not...
Well, don't you expect white people to be offended?
Yes, but I expect them to allow me to retaliate when I feel to say you are a lot of bloody savages. I expect you to allow me to say this because I can't stop people passing on the street and call me savage and call my children worse names than that. Yet I can't retaliate. Why then can't we retaliate? Is it something only allowed the white man?
The interview with Desiree brings up an age-old debate that always splits opinion amongst my friends, my family, and so many others that I've interacted with in my life. That is, whether to retaliate when faced with prejudice and racism, or to stick to your own principles of equality for all and rise above it. It's further complicated by the fact that sometimes inaction can be seen as a weakness of character instead of restraint. This internal struggle to do the right thing when facing injustice can pull you in opposite directions. It's the same struggle that faced Malcolm X, which one day led him to call white people devils and less than human, and another to walk around the Kaaba in Mecca with all races indivisible. And as Desiree explains to presenter Paddy Feeney, Michael was angry, and her words feel very current.
If you've ever been really angry, I have a filthy temper myself, and if you've ever been really angry, you know that you say the most terrible things. For instance, what he was judged on in the court, it was after a particularly botched up effort by the British government to ban Stokely Carmichael, which they, of course they did, they banned him, and it made him angry. It made the people who think Stokely is one of our heroes, made them angry. And we haven't got enough heroes of our own. We need them. My children need them. All the heroes they have are the British ones, Lord Nelson and all this. They need heroes of their own. And Michael is one, Stokely, Malcolm X. You don't have to agree with all their views, but we need our heroes very badly.
I think one of the differences is that our heroes, for the most part in the past, haven't preached hatred within their own country, whereas your husband does seem to have done this.
I think what he is preaching is not so much hatred of people. To black people, he says, become conscious of what you are. Walk around every day and know that you are black and feel black and be glad that you are. It's terribly difficult to be glad you're black, you know. And that's one thing towards the black people that Michael says.
I don't think that anybody of goodwill would deny that black people in this country have had a certain amount of prejudice against them. And I don't think that anybody in this country of goodwill would deny that it is a good thing not to be ashamed of the colour of your skin and in fact to be proud of it. But this is going one stage further. This is not just up with the black power, this is down with the white man.
I don't think it's down with the white man. It's down with white power as it is now, because black power means black people having what is their own and not just being given something. You can't be given freedom. You can't be given liberty. You have to take it. It doesn't mean fighting in a sense of taking a knife and killing somebody or lighting fires and burning houses down. But it means fighting every day of your life to change things around you, change people around you. And you can't change at this point in history. I personally don't think you can change it by holding hands in the road, singing hymns, or petitioning, or futile protests. I believe you can only do it by hard campaigning and tough attitudes.
I think the interviewer betrays a mistrust of black power. By saying it's not just up with the black power, it's down with the white man, he misses the point, echoed by the recent Black Lives Matter movement, which is essentially that black power and white power are not the same thing. White people are already in a position of power and privilege. Black power is not about taking over, but about giving power to the powerless. Despite his urbane and reasonable manner, the interviewer doesn't understand the asymmetrical power dynamics at play of a white man calling a black man savage and the historical context of being labelled a savage, thereby justifying slavery, empire, and white superiority. In his court case, Michael would further claim that his use of language was not the same as a native English speaker. In a surreal exchange with the judge, he said this:
Do you understand black people when they talk?
Yes, just as I hope that they understand me.
Are you a mama guy?
I beg your pardon?
Mama guy, I have since found out, I believe means, are you messing with me? The judge was not impressed by his defense and sentenced him to a year in prison. His sentence was harsh, considering that Roysaw and other black activists had only just been fined a week earlier for saying similar things. The judge said,
I am satisfied that you came down here to make trouble, which is just what the Race Relations Act is meant to avoid. You've set out to raise that hostility. For what purpose? I do not know. I'm quite satisfied you knew perfectly well what a mischievous act you were doing.
Michael Abdul Malik, a black man, ironically became the first person to be imprisoned under the Race Relations Act. The late Darcus Howe had this to say on Michael's imprisonment.
What struck me about Michael X, even though I completely disagreed with what he said, was when he was arrested and sentenced for saying, if you see a white man with a black woman, kill him. And I thought, well, that's a bit silly, but I used to like to hear black people say things that were brave and bold, even though if it didn't make sense, because we was too quiet.
Black power had arrived in the UK, but after Stokely Carmichael's visit and radical speech, the reaction of the state was swift and robust. A Black Power desk was set up by Special Branch to investigate and keep tabs on organizations and activists. It seems that MI5 may have also been involved. Michael was one of the main people being watched and is described in official documents I have seen as the arch disciple of Black Power in the UK. In the next episode of Who Was Michael X, Michael is released from prison, embittered and undeterred, and wanting to retaliate. He sets up another project called the Black House.
Michael doesn't believe in black power. Michael is just on a power trip for his own benefit.
Who Was Michael X was presented, written and produced by Hamza Salmi, featuring Peter de Jersey as Michael X, Andrew Walker as the judge, assistant producer Wayland Mackenzie, researcher Palumi Odubanjo, technical producer Carwyn Griffith, theme music by Kyron Akal, production mentors Claire Walker and Joe Kent, executive producers Kalik Mir and Leanne Ali, commissioned for BBC Sounds Audio Lab by Kalik Mir.